introduce him and then he can introduce you. Morning, Roy. I'll introduce you and then you can. I'll give you short and deep. Do you want a chair to sit up here while you do that?
I'll just stand.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Muters or Zoomers, you are muted, so please stay muted. At the end, if you want to ask questions, put it in the chat. I'll monitor the chat and we can ask the speaker your questions. If you're in the room and have a cell phone, if you could please silence that or turn that off, that would be greatly appreciated so it doesn't go off. And I am going to introduce Roy Hunt, who's going to come up here and introduce our speaker for today. You want this or this?
Testing, is that all right? Well, this is a very exciting lecture for me. I first visited Carcassonne in 1964. I knew very little about it, and I certainly didn't know anything about Viollet-le-Duc. I just happened into a wedding in the main church there, which added a lot to my enjoyment. But today, someone who has deep roots in Carcassonne is going to speak to us, Claire Germain, Professor Claire Germain, who came to the UF Law School in 2011. And I shall never forget the first time I saw her, because in my retirement, I had a tiny little office in the law school. There was room for only one chair. And I always left the door open because of claustrophobia. And, and one day, this strange woman sitting here in the front row appeared in my doorway. And I said, "Why are you here?" I didn't have many visitors at that point in my law career. And she said that Song Hyun Song had sent her. Well, Song Hyun Song at the time was president of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which of course is now a target of Donald Trump, sanctioned in every way. So I hope that doesn't spill over to her. But she had come to be the associate dean of the law school and a professor of law, and was in charge of, we don't call them libraries anymore, it's the Legal Information Center. So she had a long career there, and then retired, and she and her husband, Stuart Basevsky, who's sitting here beside her, moved to Okama, which delighted me, because I loved to go to dinner at their house, but I could no longer drive. Claire is the only person I know who is a chevalier or knight of the French Legion of Honor. And someday she might show you her rosette or her medal. But her scholarship, not surprisingly, is focused on comparative law. And during the next, I don't know, 2 ILR terms, she's going to talk further about Viollet-le-Duc and his restoration of Notre Dame in the 19th century, as well as other notable projects. Again, you're going to know more than perhaps you ever wanted to know about Viollet-le-Duc by the time she gets through with us. Uh, but then she's also going to talk about how Acadians became Cajuns in another lecture after the French in 1755 were expelled from Nova Scotia unless they agreed to complete loyalty to the British. So I think that the last thing I should tell you, since she's also talking about cassoulets, is that she's a fantastic French chef. And I'm not going to read you these 3 pages of her accomplishments, but I'm going to let her talk to you instead.
Thank you very much, Roy, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everybody. I'm a little bit intimidated to talk to you, but I'm also very excited to share with you what I know about Carcassonne. So it's not a travel log and it's not a personal life history, but my family will come into play a little bit throughout this presentation. No, you have to click. Yeah, we have a little clicking problem here. So what is the program today? So we of course, are going to talk about Carcassonne, steeped in 2,500 years of history. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of France in 20 minutes or less. And then one thing, you know, you see this magnificent fortified medieval city, like the stuff of fairy tales. But do you realize that it was slated for demolition at the beginning of the 19th century? All these beautiful stones, this beautiful city. If it hadn't been for the architect named Viollet-le-Duc that my friend Roy likes so much, and now I'm on Viollet-le-Duc team also. I like him a lot. So he's the one with some other friends who saved Carcassonne from demolition and made it the jewel that it is today. So we'll talk about him too. And then maybe for on the lighter side, and because the French like their food, we will talk about the iconic dish of the region, which is called cassoulet. And I will explain, you know, the way to make it and how it came about. And then, of course, also on the lighter note, what was the relationship of Walt Disney to Carcassonne, and was he inspired by the city in some of his animated movies? And you can see the way I ask the question, there may be a yes answer to that. And then, especially for some of my friends here, we'll talk a little bit about wine. And Thomas Jefferson, what does he have to do with what's known as the Blanquette de Limoux, which is a local sparkling wine? Very, actually, I have a bottle here. Very famous in my apartment. And then, as I said, I will talk a little bit about my family, because it turns out that my family has lived in the region for several generations, actually several centuries. And actually, I didn't realize all these things, and unfortunately, my parents passed away. And then I was able to do research in the houses that I inherited and discover all kinds of interesting things. When I was young, I always looked forward, but now I have more of a past than a future. So I'm interested in history even more. Okay, so maybe it's... Okay, so first of all, where is Carcassonne? Who actually knows where Carcassonne is? Good, that's very good. You're all highly Francophiles, because when I was going through the hallways and asking a few people, I'm going to talk about Carcassonne, they would look at me and see, what do you mean, Carcassonne? So Carcassonne is right here in the southwest of France. So I was born in the East, and then we moved to Paris when I was little, and I grew up in Paris. So every summer we would take the car or the train, the overnight train with my mother and my siblings, and then we would go to Carcassonne. Actually, my family lived near Carcassonne. Now, when you look at the map of France, you see France here, you see here the Mediterranean Sea, and you see the Atlantic Ocean, and you can see immediately why Carcassonne was such an interesting place at the crossroads between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So going back to antiquity, there was already a lot of trade there. And it also explains why Carcassonne was occupied by so many different groups. So the Romans came from here, and they did a lot of, we have found some amphors, you know, these big clay bottles of wine. So they were going from Marseille or all of these areas to Bordeaux and going there like this. Another thing to remark is it's very close to Andorra, and this is Spain. So Carcassonne had a very important defense role to protect France against Spain, the Kingdom of Aragon. The location of Carcassonne also explains why different populations came. Like in the 5th century, the Visigoth, the Germanic tribes came to Carcassonne. And then from the south, in 725, the Moors, the Saracens came and occupied that part. So you can see how important of a place it was and how it had to be defensive to protect against the enemy. So we've seen where Carcassonne is, and the reason why I know Carcassonne very well, I knew it as a child very well, when we would go visit my grandmother, so it's all on my mother's side. My grandmother lived in Limoux, and then Saint-Hilaire is important because that's where they make that wine. And then every time we would go see my grandfather's family, who was from Laure-Minervois, we would drive by Carcassonne. And as a child, it was mesmerizing every time you would go because Carcassonne is on a hill. So you cannot miss it from the train or from the car. And you see that beautiful, you know, fairy tale-like place. So it was very impressive as a child. And we spent every summer. So this is before my time. This was my mother. So it was back in 1930, my great-grandparents that I never knew. So fast forward many, many, many years, then I became a professor of law, and I taught at the University of Florida College of Law summer program, which was in Paris, and then Montpellier. And Montpellier is 1 hour away on the east side of Carcassonne. So we would teach there, and then I would give guided tours of Carcassonne to my students. So I think you see my husband somewhere, I'm here. Our son was there, and we did it like several years. The students would come by train, and then we would visit together, and it was a wonderful time. So I have these two sets of recollections as a child and as an adult. So now let's take a look. We're going to look at Carcassonne from different angles. What you notice here are, first of all, 2 walls protected by what's called a lice in French, L-I-C-E, which is a passage in between. So the first set was done at the beginning by the Romans in the 3rd century. And then the Visigoths continued it. And then the second one was done much later in the 13th century by the royal king. So Louis the Ninth, St. Louis, and then other kings. What you notice also are these conical roofs, and that was a big point of controversy because Viollet-le-Duc decided on these conical roofs. And supposedly, we're not sure, but supposedly they were not really, they were more roofs that you had in the north of France, but not in the south. That we'll see some of the towers are more flat and covered with terracotta tiles. And this is more like slates. So 52 towers, 3 kilometers, 1.9 miles between the, when you go all around, 2 sets of walls, a real city with streets, houses. So in the 13th century, there were some, or maybe 12th century, there were some 3,000 to 4,000 people living there and also a little bit outside. So it must have been very cramped. But I don't think people had like 2 bedrooms, 2 baths in each house. I don't think they had any bathroom actually. It was also a military fortress, and it had, so very defensive, and then it had a church, a basilica, which it still has. So that's our first approach. In the end here, you see the Black Mountain, Montagne Noire, where they had, going back centuries, they had mines there. Okay, so I promise this is the only slide with a lot of text. I just wanted to give you a very simplistic overview of all the steps, all the things, what is interesting is you can see it in the structure of the walls. You can see at the bottom, you recognize the Roman walls. Then you go a little up, you see the Visigoth. Then you see the 13th century. And then you see the Viollet-le-Duc restoration. So it's very interesting to see, analyze the way the walls are constructed and the various structures. So in the 1st century, and after, I haven't quite gone to before Common Era and after Common Era. And actually the French haven't switched because they say it started in the 7th century. So we still say after Christ, before Christ. But anyway, 1st century AD, it was a Gallo-Roman city, Carcassonne, but it was more like, it was not fortified. It was more a trade post with doing wine trade, cereal trade, oil trade. Then it's in the 3rd century that start the first Roman fortifications. Then the heydays of Carcassonne are really the 11th and the 12th century. The medieval, it was an era of medieval prosperity. Then came a funny, not funny for them, but a crusade against the Catars. I don't know if you've heard of the Catars. Anybody has heard of the Catars? Yeah, well, Stuart, of course you have heard of the Catars. Okay, very good for you. You get an extra point for knowing the Catars. And then in the late 1200s, Carcassonne was annexed by the Royal Kingdom of France. And it was, as I explained, in a strategic position to protect France against the Kingdom of Aragon. And that lasted the very important position between 1258 and 1659. But then what happened? The Treaty of Pyrenees. And that treaty pushed down the frontier between France and Spain, Aragon, much lower, further south. So they didn't need Carcassonne to protect France. So it started the decline, almost ended up in the demolition, but then Viollet-le-Duc came. And then today, in 1997, the city of Carcassonne was inscribed in the UNESCO World Patrimony Heritage. Okay. So that was not too bad. I don't know what this is here. Oh, other way. No. Okay, so now is a good time to talk a little bit about Viollet-le-Duc. And I really found a beautiful portrait for you. Isn't he romantic? There were portraits of him older, but he had lost some of his hair, so it was not as nice. I hear some noises here. Somebody doesn't approve. So Viollet-le-Duc is quite interesting. He's mainly known to be an architect, but he was also a historian, a drawing artist, a professor, a writer, a decorator. He taught at the School of Decorative Arts. He was an archaeologist, a magazine writer, an alpinist. He ended up his life hiking through the Alps and writing about the geology, the geography of the Alps. So he was born in Paris in 1814 and he died in Lausanne in Switzerland in 1879 and at the age of 65. And what is accomplished in that span of time is amazing. He's mainly known for having restored medieval buildings, so buildings, cathedrals, castles, monuments, but he also was in charge or was commissioned to restore other buildings. He wrote over 100 books, and these books were also accompanied by a very thorough bibliography. So he was really a deep thinker. And some of these most lauded restorations are Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame of Paris, Mount Saint-Michel, and Carcassonne. So we'll talk more about Viollet-le-Duc in August when I talk about Notre-Dame and the restoration. And at that time, we'll also talk about what happened after the fire. But today, we're going to focus on Viollet-le-Duc and Carcassonne, what happened there. So we go back to my family just for a moment because I need to explain how I came to know so much about Carcassonne. My great-grandfather had this, well, it was before actually, before, I don't know what you say, great-great-grandfather, well, whatever, built this house in about 1860. And then it was sold to a convent of retired nuns. And then last year, it was sold to the city. So fast forward many, many years, my grandmother built a little house behind this big house, and that's where we lived. But we came back with my family in 2012 because to celebrate my aunt's 90th birthday, and our son is here. Some of you know my nephews from Germany who are in Toronto. They're right here. They only had one child. So we came back. That's the house that my grandmother built in 1950. And after my parents died, I spent many summers in that library here doing research in the family's archive. And that's how I found out more about Carcassonne and the whole region. And I'm a professor, but I'm also a researcher. And I like to keep print. So in the family library, I kept this magazine, which is Le Tour de France, Guide du Tourisme, September 1, 1904. And I even brought it here. I just brought a few samples. And it's quite interesting because you cannot see too much, but you can look at it after the lecture. What I liked about it, back in 1904, they had that new restored city, and they wrote about it in lyrical terms, saying at a time where modernism makes it that the beautiful traditional buildings are destroyed, here is an example of a beautiful medieval city. So I like the way they talked about it. So it's a nice memento of the past. Okay, now back to the heart of the matter. In this representation, you have a nice view of the whole city. Oh, and by the way, in 1904, there were still 1,500 people living there. Today, there are only about 50 people. So, because it's mainly shops and museums. So here you see again the two fortifications. And here you see the chateau, the castle. There is a theater. At all times, they've done plays there. They've done representations of the Middle Age with the knights and so on. And then here is the Basilica, the church. You see a lot of vineyards. The place is known for the vineyards. And then this is one of the gates, and the Aude River is there. You know, the city is on a hill, so it protects it. You have beautiful views and you can see your enemy. So you get to it, there's a bridge there, you get here, and it's complicated. You know, you have several steps before you can get in, so that every step of the way, people can throw the arbalets or, you know, do whatever they do to attack you and defend themselves. So now I'm going to show you something that hardly anyone knows about because it's not open to the public. We saw that the chateau from above, this is the inside of the yard. So, and then here you see a close-up. And underneath that little block here, which is somewhere in the yard, somebody in 2006 discovered that the city had been built during the Romans or in the 3rd century over a Gallo-Roman villa. So that was before the fortifications. And they discovered these beautiful mosaics. So, and it's not open to the public, only found it because I did in-depth research in the French sources. So you can, if you ever talk to Carcassonne, to some people, you can say, oh, do you know about the mosaics? And they won't. Okay, I'm gonna show you some examples of remains of previous constructions. Like this, for instance, this is one of the oldest tower. It's the Roman tower of the La Marquière, 3rd to 4th century late Roman Empire. And here you're going to see also the different levels of stones like built over. So the specificity of that tower is that it's flat, a flat roof. It's also, the shape is a horseshoe, you can see, and you can see the Roman windows. This, it's called crenellation. That's an innovation of Viollet-le-Duc because he thought it would look more medieval. So that didn't exist, another point of controversy. This is what you see from inside that Roman tower. And that little business here is a stone piece which was part of the Roman rampart, and it serves as support for the foundation. And as you can see, here you have the terracotta, the red tiles. Okay, here we see the Narbonne Gate, which is, yeah, so I think that, no, that's not the one from the river, that's the other side. What is there to see? You see the difference. What they've done in the 60s, they replaced some of the slate roofs with the terracotta tiles. Okay, oh yeah, there is that Lady Carcasse, and there is a legend about her. And I don't like the legend, so I don't know if I should tell you about it. But when I don't, people say, what about the legend? Supposedly, it was erected in the 16th century, and it's a Muslim princess, Saracens princess, and she defended the castle. I don't know why. Oh, yeah, it was in the hands of the Saracens at the time. And they were besieged and by Charlemagne, but apparently Charlemagne was not there at that time, but that's how the legend goes. And they were besieged for many days, and everybody was starving, but she had a big pig, very fat. So she fattened the pig and she threw the pig over the rampart to make believe that they had a lot of food. And supposedly she saved the city because then the enemy thought they had lots of food and they went away. So anyway, so here is a pont-levis, a drawbridge. That was an addition from Viollet-le-Duc. And when I show you these, the crenellation, the pont-levis, why did it change the latest constructions? The reason is that he wanted to create an idealized medieval city of the 13th century. So he had, it was not willy-nilly. He had an idea. He wanted a complete unity. So here is another view. You see the Lady Carcasse. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about that. In like the 11th, 12th century, France was not unified, of course, and there were local lords, counts and viscounts. And there was one in particular who was in Carcassonne by the name of Count or Viscount of Trincavel. So I just wanted to show you the inside of his armory. I see Stuart is checking 10:30. Okay. Inside the dungeon, there's these very nice paintings. These mural paintings were done from the 12th to the 13th century, and they were discovered in 1926. Those you can see. And they seem to represent a crusade of the Saracens against the Crusaders. And so it's kind of a nice feature that you can find in the castle. So Carcassonne and the Cathars. Cathars, it was a religious movement against the wealth and corruption of the Catholic Church. Now, they were not seen with a blessing by the royal power and by the Pope. They were protected by the Count or Viscount of Trincavel. So what happened to them, these poor heretics, they were burned. They were expelled and then burned. And you can see here they're being burned. So the Pope started a crusade, and then Raymond Trincavel was defeated by Simon de Montfort. And what happened next in 1226 is that Carcassonne was attached to the royal domain. And I think behind that question about religious war, what they wanted, the royal power wanted Carcassonne and the whole area to be annexed to the French domain, as opposed to Trincavel, who wanted to keep its fiefdom. Some other vestiges of times past. This is a Visigoth tower, and this one is the Inquisition Tower, because not everything was about fairy tales, you know, in the city. So there were some terrible things happening there. First and foremost, it was a military fortress, and this is also an innovation from Viollet-le-Duc to restore these things that are called hourds. Here you see a view from the bridge to get to the, that's what, this is like the lower town. Okay, the Haute Gate, I wanted to show you, like, the Visigoths are the ones who did this, the first, because the second wall was done in the 13th century. So the first one, and then this arc was done in the 12th century. This is, here you can see there are lots of shops. You can buy swords. You can buy all kinds of mementos. The basilica is beautiful. It was built from the 9th to the 14th century. It has, you can see it's called flamboyant Gothic from the south. Beautiful stained glass window. I wanted to show you this. The stained glass window is the temptation of Adam and Eve. So they've survived, many of them. And you can see the difference between the Roman portal and the Gothic flamboyant. So the basilica was the first thing that was restored by Viollet-le-Duc. It was classified as a national monument. I think it was in 1840. I put 49, but 40. Okay, as I explained, when after the Treaty of the Pyrenees, Carcassonne no longer played the defensive role. It was not needed anymore. So in the 19th century, it was terrible what happened. There was still some military there, but Napoleon in 1802 wanted to declassify it. Well, actually declassified it as a military monument. So the walls were dismantled. People would take the stones and make their own buildings with it. The towers were gone. So it was really in a pitiful state. people started building slum houses because there were only poor people, weavers, workers. The wealthy people had left for the lower city. So it was slated by demolition until a group of 3 people mounted a campaign and decided to save the city. So they are very famous in France: Jean-Pierre Cros-Mayerville, Prosper Mérimée, and Viollet-le-Duc. You can see how they had built houses in between the 2 fortifications. So what Viollet-le-Duc did is expropriate. There were about 112 houses. He expropriated them, which was not so great for them. Now, I want to show you how good a drawing artist Viollet-le-Duc was. He used the chambre claire, an optical instrument where he could see, could draw, and at the same time, he could see the subject. So you can see his drawing before and then what he wanted to do. He did a very thorough study of the place. He wrote a book about the history. So his doctrine is to restore a building is not to maintain it, repair it, or remake it. It is to reestablish it in a complete state which may never have existed at any given moment. So that in France was ultra controversial because he was so criticized. But for him, he wanted Carcassonne to be an idealized view of a medieval city of the 13th century. For him, he loved medieval architecture and Gothic architecture. He said Carcassonne was the pinnacle. So this shows you vividly how it was before in 1860, how it was in 1890, and how it was in 2019. So you can see the difference. What were the main points of controversy? We talked about pointed roofs instead of flat, gray slate roofs instead of red tiles, created a drawbridge added to one of the gates, crenellation on the walls. Some people said it was too Gothic, too perfect, but he saved the city from demolition and made it into a jewel. Those are my words. So I think he did a good job. Another, you see the vineyards. It's a beautiful landscape there with little hills. So at all times, there've been all kinds of plays and concerts at the city of Carcassonne. What is very famous is July the 14th, Bastille Day. You have that beautiful fireworks. Okay, so this is it for Carcassonne, just the tip of the iceberg, but you can ask questions. Now, did Walt Disney get his inspiration from Carcassonne for the animated movie Sleeping Beauty? What do you think? I read many articles, but one that I read that was very interesting, that's recent. France, an endless source of inspiration for Disney and Disneyland Paris. Now, do you know about Walt Disney, where his family is from? Missouri? Are you the troublemaker here? Well, it could have been from Missouri, but what about in 1066? In 1066, his ancestors were living in a small place in Normandy called Isigny-sur-Mer. So that was his first original name, Isigny, but then it was changed to Disney. So here you've heard it. So apparently, I assume it's true. I haven't verified it. We have to ask Mormon people to check. But back in 1066, his ancestor was a companion of William the Conqueror, who left Normandy to conquer England. So then the Lord, his companion, went to England, resided there, but as name, took the name Isigny because he was born there. So Walt Disney always liked France, visited France all the time, visited Carcassonne in 1959. So whether he took inspiration from Carcassonne for Sleeping Beauty, people like to say it, to be honest, it's possible, but he could also have taken inspiration from other castles in France, from Mont Saint-Michel. So there, you know, but you will find that theme in many of his, when you do research on Walt Disney, many of his movies have been inspired by castle in France, in Germany, and other places. Okay, Cassoulet. Cassoulet was, as I said, I'm a researcher, so I like to get to the bottom of things. Originally, it was made, like when I say originally, it could be back to the 14th century. It was made with fèves, which are broad beans, like the green beans, because beans, as we know them, white beans, were introduced only in this 16th century from South America. So, and they started being cultivated in the area near Carcassonne. So they're called haricots lingots, and the equivalent here would be a great northern bean. You can see they're different from the kidney beans, which look more like kidneys. There are three famous cassoulets. The most famous is Castelnaudary. There is a Toulouse, and then there's a Carcassonne version. How do you make a real cassoulet? It's codified, but you can make it the way you like. Typically, you will have some beans, duck or goose size, some saucisse de Toulouse. It's a pork sausage, a little bit like Italian sausage, but no fennel. Pork meat hock. I hear somebody yawn. Who's been yawning? Okay, pork rind, pork bones, onions, and carrots. And then you do it in that special casserole because you have more that can form a crust on the top. So it's so important that to respect the tradition of that dish, that they have a fraternity of the cassoulet de Castelnaudary. You know, the French take their food seriously, and I recognize myself there. Okay, now the Blanquette de Limoux. Sparkling wine. The big question, is it older than champagne? So people in Limoux say yes. They say it was invented by a monk. Actually, there are archival papers that demonstrate that it was truly invented by a monk in Saint-Hilaire, near Limoux, in 1532. And it has obtained the controlled designation of origin. And Thomas Jefferson, his relationship is that in his cellar, there is a list of the wines he was keeping, and you can see here that he had 49 bottles of Blanquette of Limoux, and he had only 22 bottles of Scuppernong. Now, I don't know if you know how you make, how the Blanquette or the sparkling wine was invented. The Benedictine monk was doing his wine, and he put a cork on the wine. And then all of a sudden, he noticed that there were bubbles forming inside. So he opened it, and that's how sparkling wine came about. And at the beginning, it was not fashionable. And then a little bit later, the bottles would explode. So they had to find out how to make it so that they wouldn't explode. And then it became fashionable. So you see, you're learning a lot with me today, right? Okay, so when I was maybe in Ithaca, well, I don't know if any of you have gone on a boat trip on the Canal du Midi. No, it's become very fashionable to do that. You get on a boat and you can go from here. And that started in the 17th century, so that you wouldn't have to go through the Detroit of Gibraltar. So that's like an important discovery. Okay, and I think I'm going to stop. We only have 15 minutes for questions. I didn't translate that, but those are some of the things I found in my family treasure trove. My ancestor was a merchant, so there was he was a merchant. He had a store on the main square. he sold textiles, and he had old stamps, like the very first stamps were in 1849. And you can see it's a Greek profile. And then the stamps in 1852, it became an empire. So that's Napoleon III. So those have a kind of a certain value. It's kind of moving to see the very first stamps. Now that we're not going to use stamps anymore, different era. And I discovered some fabric samples, and they are in my apartment here, and they look like brand new, but they are 1852. So that's, I like to keep this. I was quite amazed. It's good quality. Okay, and then one of my ancestors was beheaded, is right here, décapité. He was the king's printer, one of the king's printers. So that I discovered in the library. And then my great uncle was a friend of Émile Durkheim, who is the founder of sociology. But they don't have I have some of the letters, but they're more about, I'm going to get married next week. It was not about the fundamentals of sociology, and then lots of rare books there. Then my grandfather was a prisoner during the war. Okay, some people, young people, they only know Carcassonne because it became a board game. So I just wanted you to know that. And this, I think they use the zoom a little too much, but this is a nice pictures with the Pyrenees in the background. But I've never seen it exactly like that. I see more like that. Okay, so I rushed a little bit toward the end so that we would have some time for questions. But this is the end. Thank you.
Are there questions?
Yes. Oh.
I'll come with the mic here just a sec. Okay, questions? Where do I start? Okay, here we go.
How long does it take to prepare cassoulet?
Oh, well, it has to cook for a long time because the beauty of these beans, I'm going to be technical, is that they don't get mushy. But at the same time, I hate it when I have cassoulet and the beans are still crunchy. So you want them melting in your mouth. So long time. You know, French cookbooks are not as precise as American cookbooks. A few hours. Oh, it's a peasant dish, by the way. It goes back a long time. You know, the whole area is rural. So you put it on the side near the fireplace and it cooks for a long time. And sometimes you just put your leftovers there. It could cook the whole day, I think, if you watch it.
When are you planning your next tour there?
Well, after my parents died, we spent several summers with my aunt. And then I inherited 2 houses, but they were not in very good shape. And I sold one and gave one to my brother. So my brother is there now.
Is the sparkling Limoux wine available in the US?
Good question. Yes, it is. I don't have any stock, but you can find it easily at Fresh Market.
Thank you.
It's nice shape for the bottle. It's a nice wine for an appetizer or as a dessert. Or to eat with the, but I think to eat with the cassoulet, a robust red wine is probably better.
Any other questions? I saw several hands up. Okay, no? Let me just, I gotta check the chat. Hold on 1 second. Okay, there's questions on the Zoom. Can you read it? Can you see it? Here, take this off.
Oh, I think the question is,
This off, hold this.
okay.
And right over here.
Okay. The question is, I was in Carcassonne 3 years ago, but I have learned so much more from you today. Thank you. Oh, I'm blushing. And yes, I have read about the Qatars. Question, where did Le Duc get the funds for his restoration? Well, it's a good question because he got his money from the French government because there was a fund to restore buildings, but he could only get a certain sum. You know, that was before generous American benefactors provided money. I think that was too early. I mean, now we are really, we owe a lot of gratitude, we French people, to the American benefactors for the restoration of Notre Dame. I haven't read that at that time they did it for Carcassonne. So it was French money. And sometimes it was interrupted. For instance, the works were interrupted during the 1870 war against Germany, and then it picked up again. And Viollet-le-Duc didn't see the end of the restoration. He died because he died relatively young, so his son oversaw the completion. How long did it take to restore Carcassonne? Many years, I think from 1853 until 1879. And then they keep on restoring. They just, they have to fortify the construction or restore them. So they did a big project that was just completed last September. So they work on it all the time. Now it's being seen by 4 million people every year. So it's a very popular attraction.
Other questions?
I think it would be interesting to compare, if you're going to make this trip, I don't know who that was, the restoration of Sarlat in the Dordogne, which was post-World War II, and it's considered the first restoration of an entire town in France in a more scientific way. Who was the Minister of Culture who a well-known minister of culture, that was his favorite project. And the University of Florida Alumni Association did a week-long stay in Sarlat that I attended.
Maybe André Malraux? André Malraux?
Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting to compare those two, but certainly what Viollet-le-Duc did in Carcassonne was important in terms of historic preservation, even though there are quibbles now with the purity of it.
Well, I think it's now universally accepted. It was more at the time because he didn't go to school, to a formal school. He could have gone to the School of Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, but at the time it was very traditional. They only copied the classical models. So instead, he went on the road with his uncle. They went throughout France and he drew pictures and watercolors of various churches and monuments in France. And then the following year, he did the same thing in Italy. So it is I don't know what you think about how restoration should be done. And for Carcassonne, what time frame do you want to restore the place to? To the 12th century, 13th, 16th, 17th? So at least he had a doctrine. He wanted a complete entity. He wanted a medieval city. So it was not haphazardous. He studied everything. He did archaeology. He wrote about it. But, you know, I don't know if you have any thought about what the principles of restoration should be. And it's not that he was not modern. He also wrote about the importance of using iron in buildings. But he also looked at the buildings from the Middle Ages and he said they were so well done that with so much measure that you don't have to change things necessarily to be more modern.
Well, this has been a wonderful talk, and I think that most everybody will be back for Viollet-le-Duc and Notre Dame, and later for Acadians to Cajuns. So thank you, Claire.
Thank you again.
I just want to make an announcement on our first class, the March 24th class with the Hong Kong movies with Allison Connor has been rescheduled. It will be when we do the whole series on this course, the very next Monday, May 5th, 10 o'clock here in the Oak Room, we will have Allison Connor's presentation. So mark your calendars and I'll send you a reminder. May? Did I say May? Yes, it would be after this April. Our last class on the books here is April 28th, and it's the following Monday. Yes. Following Monday. Thank you.